Welcome to Rowling Studies. This is the podcast of the Hogwarts Professor. My name is Nick Jeffery, and I'm a writer at Hogwarts Professor, and I'm joined with
Dr. John Granger, the Dean of Harry Potter Scholars and the Hogwarts Professor himself. It's a wonder to be here, Nick.
So this is our first pilot episode for Rowling Studies. And John, do you want to tell us a little bit about what we're going to be doing here?
Our primary aim here is to stretch your thinking. I'm assuming you're a serious striker, a Potter pundit, a Rowling rereader. What Nick and I want to do here is challenge, even to upset your ideas, if not your feelings, about who Rowling is, what she's writing, why we should care. I mean, there are plenty of fan sites that share excitement and enthusiasm or which deliver conventional approaches in thinking about story in general and Rowling specifically. Rowling Studies, this podcast, is not one of those podcasts. If you want a roller coaster ride of contrary thinking and ideas that will demand you reconsider the way most readers think, you're in the right place.
That's not to say that we're not excited or we're not enthused by what Rowling writes. I think the point is we want to know why. We want to know what it is about what J.K. Rowling produces that creates, that generates this excitement and enthusiasm.
And that's always been the question. Whence Pottermania, etc. Our focus, in addition to that, is also unique. This is not a Harry Potter podcast, a Cormoran Strike podcast, or even the latest thing Rowling has written or is about to publish podcast. By Rowling Studies, we aim to deliver a view of anything Rowling has written or is writing in the context of everything she has written. All her books and screenplays and script, but mostly her novels, as well as her interview catalog of 25 years. In the 15 years since the publication of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Rowling has surpassed in page count all of her Wizarding World efforts with non-magical texts, the themes and artistry of which books throw important light on her more famous work. Again, if you want an integrated, inclusive, higher view of Rowling's writing, you're in the right place. That's what we're about here at Rowling Studies, as we are at the Hogwarts Professor weblog and Substack.
And we do mean everything. So within the past few weeks, I have reread my favorite of all Rowling's works, Casual Vacancy. I've reread, because we're just decorating our house in time for the Christmas season, I've reread A Christmas Pig, and we will shortly be talking about both of those works.
Boy, Nick, they should tag you and follow you around. Anybody that thinks Casual Vacancy is your favorite work, that is an amazing thing. It speaks to your perspective. All right, but back. So we talked about our attitude. It's not just enthusiasm, but though it is enthusiastic, the focus is very broad. Not just the latest work, not what she's working on now, but the biggest twist about Rowling Studies is what we think of as being a generational shift in the field. We aim to talk about what we know about Rowling's life, her core beliefs and defining experiences, what she has said inspired her work. Rowling Studies is a study of Rowling the person then, as well as Rowling the writer. A common sense, but to this point neglected aspect of understanding her work, despite the author's insistence that it is essential to that project. Some of that necessarily will be speculative, because as much as the author has invited a biographical reading, she has also taken real care to guard her past and to choose friends that will not discuss it outside their close circle. If you're equal to connecting the dots between, say, Rowling's personal ups and downs and the plot lines of her work, her lake inspiration, in order to gain a greater appreciation of her shed artistry, and I'll explain those terms later, you're going to love the conversation here at Rowling Studies, because we will be diving into that lake, as weird as that is for me.
So we very much are different scholars when it comes to studying Rowling's work. I mean, John has pioneered the structure and artistry of Rowling's shed work, the mechanics of how she constructs her story for decades. I joined my journey into studying Rowling, the first book I ever read from hers was my favourite, The Casual Vacancy. Probably the most obviously biographic all of her works, and I have been interested to the point of obsession studying beyond the headline story of the penniless single mother in Edinburgh, through her meteoric rise, her charity work. Her life is fascinating. That what we know of her life, it is fascinating. And you can see in many of her works where some of that comes through. Now that's a big part of her lake, of her inspiration. The other part, of course, I think has been much better documented. And that's the inspiration she takes from literature. I think life and literature are the two key threads to that lake inspiration.
Yeah, and this is not gossip. And this is the reason I've come around to. When I read Casual Vacancy, I wrote a post in 2012 saying, "Okay, look, it's an idiot's work to connect the dots here. You know, every character in this book is a rolling shadow." And in that same post, I said, but we're not going to go there because it doesn't help us understand her artistry. It's not, it's like, let's pretend that Shakespeare was not a human being. He was a machine that produced these plays. We don't care about Shakespeare the person. We want to get at Shakespeare the text and the plays. And I took that snob position that we're not going to go into the lake because of basically a C.S. Lewis position called the personal heresy. Don't reduce the author's work to just being projection from their personal life. I've largely through my contact with Nick and conversations with Nick, I've been brought around to you must integrate the lake to understand really the accomplishments in the shed. And again, just real quickly, this lake and shed comment comes from a 2019 interview that Rowling did with the BBC 4 program, the Museum of Curiosity, in which she discussed her process, her writing process from inspiration to publication. And in that thing, she says basically she has two images that she uses, the lake and the shed. The lake is what she described as basically her unconscious mind gives her story ideas that are snapshots of her unresolved psychological issues. And she takes this story stuff, this blob, because she describes something like molten glass, and she takes it into her shed where she reflects on it and transforms it into proper narrative. So it's not just, Joe's problems projected. It's not Mary Jane stories, whatever they call this. It's not like that. It's Rowling transcending her personal thing and actually coming to terms with her unresolved issues in her stories. But you can't get what the shed is about until you get the stuff out of the lake. And so Nick's contribution here, one, I think you live 8 blocks from the scene of Casual Vacancy. I mean, isn't that just down the street?
It's barely an hour away.
That's I mean, it's spooky. You're a long way from Oklahoma City. That perspective that Nick brings to this, I think, is a revolutionary one, really, for Rowling Studies, and that we're going to integrate Rowling and her life into an appreciation of her as an artist, which is, of course, where every writer of note, studies of every writer of note, to include the Shakespeare I just talked about, is about now. You can't get at the transcendent artist without understanding the specific person who generates that artistry. And Rowling is certainly no exception to that. She invites that thing with her Lake and Shed interview and discussion of her process. All right. Well, and having said all that, that we're not going to be the podcast that talks about Rowling's latest work and in anticipation of her next work. Let's just jump into discussion of Running Grave in anticipation of what Strike 8 will be about. Why are we doing that, Nick?
So we're doing that because we are the podcast that believes in breaking all the rules. We're also, I think, going to dive straight into structure in this one as well.
We're going to break our own rules just to show that we're. I love it. We're the iconoclasts of iconoclasts. I love it. Let's just totally go off the board. All right, Nick. this podcast, we haven't mentioned it yet, but this first podcast is really about Charlotte Campbell Ross. Certainly one of the great creations of Rowling's entire works. Though she's largely in the shadows. We don't really see that. We don't get that much Charlotte Campbell Ross. I think Running Grave may be the most we see of her and hear from her in any specific books. Troubled Blood is close, but I mean this is a big deal. Charlotte Campbell and Running Grave. She even speaks to us coming back from the dead. I mean this is a remarkable. We get a surfeit of Charlotte Campbell Ross material. We are led to believe that Charlotte Campbell Ross committed suicide. That she slit her wrists in the bathtub and bled out there. Leaving a suicide note that told all, a note which has since been destroyed. And all of us, except for one person, all of us were totally on board with that. I mean, we've been set up for that brilliantly, except for you, Nick. Nick, tell your story of discovery. What made you think that Charlotte had been murdered rather than commit suicide?
Well, John, I'd really like to say that I noticed this because J.K. Rowling told me to look out for it on page 1, chapter 1, part 1, where we have Strike interrogated by a gaggle of ladies at the christening ceremony, asking, "When did you realize?"
Those are harpies.
Harpies. When did you realize it wasn't suicide? I'd love to say that, but I sailed straight through that. But I always pay attention to Charlotte. And I have done all the way from Cuckoo's Calling, because Charlotte is a strange character for a feminist to write. So the Psycho X is the classic trope that an abusive partner brings forth when they're explaining previous relationships to a new girlfriend. Now we know in Ink Black Heart, Philip Ormond, the classic abusive boyfriend, uses it of his ex-wife, and we know immediately that it's one of those lines. But we get Strike constantly using the same lines. Don't listen to Charlotte. Charlotte lies. Charlotte's just trying to create drama. And that's exactly what an abusive partner would say. Now, we know, because we're with the author on this, that in this case, it's true. When we first came across her in Cuckoo's Calling, and of course I read it many years after the grand reveal, so I knew exactly who the author was, I thought it was an incredibly subtle trick to try and convince the reader that the author is male, that there is this Psycho X made real. But she comes back the same, book after book after book. Now I started really paying attention when we first heard about her in The Running Grave, and it was that news report with her new partner, strangely blank and glassy-eyed. So there's something there, and we hear about the assault. But as soon as the suicide was announced, in near enough the middle of the book, I remembered John writing about the chiastic structure of these suicides that were murders in 1, 4, and 7, anticipating 7 being the end of the series, and we would be investigating the apparent suicide of Leader Strike. At that point, I was convinced, okay, we have a 147 murder disguised as suicide. Somebody has killed Charlotte. But my big question is, okay, that's how I got there. John, why didn't you see it? I mean.
Yeah. That's pretty embarrassing, Nick. When you say the reason you got it was because I told you it would be there, and then I don't see it. Well, okay, I'm going to explain why I didn't see it. We expected that 7 would have a fake suicide murder in it. But we expected that fake suicide murder would be Leda Strike's murder. All right, and hence all of the speculation at Hogwarts Professor about who killed Leda Strike. And I still think Dave Polworth is the man. But anyway, we really thought that for the latch of the series to work. Remember, we thought then it was strictly a 7-book series. She said more, but I didn't have a number. We didn't really see it. So you're saying 7 is going to be the end. It's the parallel series idea says it's going to be like Potter. Therefore, we're going to see that mystery that we have from the very start, Leda Strike's death. It's going to be resolved in this book. Well, then we get the synopsis in the first chapters, and then we get the whole book, and there's nothing really in it about Leda other than that, yeah, she was at that Norfolk commune. There's just nothing in there about Leda. So, okay, so we're going to 10 books. This is not that kind of close. But that big push, too, from Rowling that it was not going to be 7 books, that 7 was not going to be the finale, it was going to go to 10 books. That dissipated the expectation for me, and if it did for me, it probably did for everybody else, that 147 would play out as well as it did. Now, I spent 6 weeks documenting that 147 indeed was a real thing, that Cuckoo's Calling, Lethal White, and Running Grave are the axis of a completed ring in a 7-book series. And I do hope somebody other than you, Nick, will read all of those books. I shouldn't say that. There's some marvelous subscribers, Albus and Ed and Sandy and others at Hogwarts Professor and Substack that have clearly read all of those things. But there's no excuses. I just forgot all that work and expectations that we had over 5-6 years that 7 was going to have a fake suicide in it. And yeah, I what can I say, Nick? I was, despite all of my, larger view pretensions and such, I was totally sucked in to Rowling's setup. All right? Now, okay. I've touched on this 10-book problem because we do have a 10-book problem, and that 7 really did. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff that has to be resolved besides the Robin Cormoran relationship. We do need extra books. We do need at least a book 8 or something. But you argue almost in passing that the Charlotte was murdered idea is a potential solution to the 10-book series problem. You got to explain that. First review the problem and how Charlotte's murder could explain how the next 3 books relate to the first 7.
Okay, so I think that there is a strong argument that we have that 7-book cycle. It works chiastically. It works as a parallel series. So we have that 7-book block, and we have the murder-suicides 147. Now, that leaves another 3, and we don't know really where they fit yet. Evan's got a brilliant post on his proposed solution to that structure. But I think we can all agree that if we're going to solve Leda's murder, that's going to be in 10. That's going to be the finale. So then we have murder-suicides in 1, 4, 7, and 10. Well, we've got that 7-book structure, and we've got 3. We need something to latch those together. And we have this suicide in 7, investigation in 8, latch to bring those 2 series together.
So what you're saying is that we're going to get Charlotte's murder investigated in 8, really, so that 7 and 8 almost bleed in one to the other. Though it's a shocking reveal in the beginning of 8. We're going to have a real landmark beginning to 8 in that it's clear that Murphy's about to propose. We don't know if he's going to try to catch Robin in a pregnancy trap, not knowing that she's sterile. But that's another podcast. And Robin just reeling from the fact that Strike has all but said, and again, he doesn't quite say it, but it's all but said, "I love you, dear. Please marry me." She's reeling from that, and then we get something that, maybe it's one of Charlotte's other crazy brothers who comes in and says, there's a lot going on here that you don't know about this billionaire boyfriend and Emilia. That transition that you're describing between 7 and 8, so that 7 and 8 just slip right into each other with those big changes, that just remarkable, sea change type moments, really as big as the opening of book 1, where Robin is getting engaged and Cormoran is dealing with a breakup with Charlotte. So book 8, you're saying, is going to begin with Robin's engagement, figurative or literal, with Cormoran, and Strike's really coming to terms with Charlotte and her death. And that will then lead you think I'm excited about this and enthusiastic, but I'm putting it together. You think book 10 is going to finally be the lead of Strike mystery?
I think it's got to be. I think that is the mystery that we've been following ever since book 1. That's got to be the if there's going to be a series finish, that's going to be the series finisher. But that seismic moment that Strike realizes that Charlotte's death is a murder, I was convinced was going to happen in 7. So we had this interview with Emilia that was delayed and finally happened. And I read that interview in almost disbelief. I had to read it again because I thought my eyes were tricking me. I was convinced that Emilia was going to demand that Strike starts the investigation there and then.
But this is so funny because I, along with every other serious striker on the planet, read that chapter thinking, oh yeah, Charlotte, we knew she was going to commit suicide, and we don't think it's weird at all that Strike says, let me tell you what she wrote in that note. I'm not even going to have you tell me. I'm going to tell you what she wrote. And Emilia just nods her head like, yeah, sure, you go ahead and tell me about something you haven't even read because you know so much about it. And I'm telling you that another reason that I didn't think that Charlotte was murdered was that I wanted her to have committed suicide. I want Charlotte out of the way. All of us on Team Strike, which is everybody, because, Team Robin and Strike really want the two of them to get together. It's the happily ever after ending that we're all longing for. Everything points to. And the biggest obstacle in the way has been Charlotte Campbell Ross. Robin has her insecurities about her. Strike has his fears that this infection is going to, come up in him again and take it over his soul. And everybody wants Charlotte out of the way. So when Charlotte Campbell commits suicide, praise God. It's one of those death of Scrooge type moments where we'll dance on her grave. We're so happy to have her out of the way so that the real business of the story can continue, that we did not think, wow, this woman was suffering throughout this entire book, begging Strike for an opportunity to meet with her so she could share some of her issues. Nothing. He just cuts her off. In fact, he doesn't quite kill her, but he does nothing to stop this death. He admits that he is largely responsible for her death and that he did nothing to stop her.
Cormoran essentially was helping you and the rest of the strikers out there as hard as he possibly could.
That's right.
In terms of his SIB technique, that was an anti-interview. He got nothing from Emilia. He told Emilia what the evidence was going to say. He essentially held his hand up as being the guilty party anyway.
Yeah, it's genius misdirection. We'll talk about that. Citing, Nick, that you've done there, where you've said that 7 and 8 are going to be the Charlotte Campbell Ross murder mystery. That once again we have a suicide. Are there any suicides in Strike that are not suspicious? That suicide is not a suicide. That she was drunk or drugged. And a guy came in, saw her there, undressed her, put her in the bathtub, sliced her wrists, and she's dead. And walks out. Maybe she's already drafted her suicide note or something. So it's a perfect set. He walks out. Now that brilliant. Not only do you get the murder, did you spot the murder, but you've explained the chief mystery of the structure, which is how we're going to link the 1 through 7 ring, which is a tight ring, with the remaining 3 books. And essentially, you're saying you're going to see 8 be a continuation of 7 to link it to the first ring, 10 being the final resolution in Leda. I guess we'll have to have another podcast to discuss what Strike 9 is going to be, because everything else is already laid out. You've done that for us. Anyway.
But you found more evidence. So you found more structural evidence that this is a real possibility. And this is somehow based on dragons?
Yeah, it's dragons. It's always in the dragons. Yeah, again, this is our larger view thing. Go back to the Potter series, because Cormoran Strike is a parallel series to Harry Potter, with addenda, obviously. But the 7 books have been written in parallel. And what we see in 1, 4, and 7 is that, really the structures of Philosopher's Stone, Goblet of Fire, and Deathly Hallows are essentially the same. You've got 3 big adventures that the trio take, and they come to some magical object. I mean, even the last battle in the 3 books, where the gauntlet they run in Philosopher's Stone to get to the Mirror of Erised, the gauntlet that Harry runs in the last Triwizard Tournament obstacles, and the Battle of Hogwarts set things. There's 7 elements. Of course, it's 7 elements in each of the book, from a magical plant to a riddle to a mythical creature. 1, 4, and 7 are like images of each other, so you see that story access. But an interesting extra to that foundational similarity between 1, 4, and 7 is the dragons, in that you see a baby dragon born in Philosopher's Stone, pretty close to the action of the book. I mean, Philosopher's Stone is a weird book, because Harry doesn't even get to Hogwarts until chapter 7 of a 16-chapter book. So pretty close to the beginning of the action. You get Norbert or Norberta, and Hagrid's birthing it from an egg in his hut. And then you go to book 4, and really the dead center of at least the Triwizard Tournament, which is the first Triwizard Tournament event, is the dragons. The Hungarian Horntail. Really, the chapter called Hungarian Horntail is the dead center of the entire series. It's the center of the center book of the 7-book series. And there you see not a baby, though you see eggs, but you see, dragons in their majestic glory, maternal glory. These very mature, very dangerous adult dragons. And then you go to book 7, and near the end, it's chapter 26 out of 36 chapters, you get the Ukrainian Iron Belly, an Ancient of Days in the deep, darkest depths of Gringotts, who is their means to exit and go on with the rest of the story. Now, so you see in the progression from the dragons in 1, 4, and 7, you see the first book has the baby, the second book has the adult, and the third part of the axis, the 7th book, has this Ancient of Days thing. Now, if you take that structural thing and you look over to Cormoran Strike, which again is a parallel series, you're going to see that the book opens with John Bristow. Well, the first book opens with a murder. You got Lula Landry splattered on the street, and you've got Carver screaming, "The cow jumped! It's a suicide. It's obvious." Then the first chapter of note is John Bristow arriving and saying, "I want you to investigate this murder." So here's a sibling of sort, a step sibling, coming in and saying, "I don't think she committed suicide. I think she was murdered." John Bristow, of course, has every good reason to believe that she was murdered, having shoved her off the roof. But the next, if you go to 4, there's plenty of suicides after that in Career of Evil and the Silkworm. But in the 147 sequence, you get a fake suicide. It's in the dead center of Lethal White, where Jasper Chiswell's body is discovered by Cormoran and Robin at the end of part 1, which isn't labeled part 1, and then part 2 opens up with Izzy Chiswell meeting with Strike, saying, "There's no way that my near relation committed suicide. It was a murder." And he, of course, does the same thing to Bristow, saying, "Oh, well, everybody who commits suicide is caught on this side, and da da da. It's almost word for word repetition of his interview with Bristow. So much so that you're thinking, is he Chiswell killed her father? It's just, you're thinking this is such a parallel. And again, that part 2, that missing page mystery in Lethal White, the missing page is part 1. There's no part 1. But Rowling gives you part 2, which says, now we're at the second half of book 4. We're starting the second half of the series to bring us back to book 7. And so Strike begins the investigation. I think Beatrix Grove's marvelous. She just, has any detective novel of this length ever put off the murder until the halfway point in the book? Well, Rowling did that deliberately. So you'd have the beginning at the beginning of the first book, and in the middle part, you have another beginning with an interview with a near relation of the person who committed suicide, supposedly saying no, it was a murder, and it turns out to have been a murder. Of course, one committed by another near relation, her step sibling. All right, so the parallels there are pretty strong. And then we get to Running Grave. Now, in Running Grave, we don't get the suicide until the middle of the book. And as you just pointed out, we don't get the interview with her until the end of the book. And so this is an argument very much in favor of your idea of book 8 being really the continuation of book 7, the bleed from the first series into the second series, 8, 9, and 10, because 8 is going to be the investigation that should have begun properly at the end of book 7. Even though Rowling has set us up entirely to believe that Charlotte was the suicide throughout the entire series, it's been, I think it's Ilsa that says, look, there's 2 types of suicides. There's the one where she's just pretending, and then there's one where she's really going at it. She's trying to kill herself. And we see a de facto, suicide in Troubled Blood. Only Strike's, Red Cross Knight behavior to save her that he'd do for anybody. Really the peak of his otherworldly love for people. His really being the Fury, Tisiphone. He's that man. He's at the top of his game in Troubled Blood. We see him come down from that standard of helping her the way he would help anybody else to basically grinding her under his heel as a person that he doesn't give any love for, because he wants so much for her to be out of the way so he can begin his relationship with Robin. And again, we're all on board with that. I've seen hilarious things online where people start to explain it in really highfalutin psychological language, how you can't be an enabler to a suicide victim, that you're not responsible for this. Come on. We get to see Strike at his best in Troubled Blood do just the opposite of what these people are excusing in Running Grave, and there's a problem here. And that's because Charlotte didn't commit suicide. Strike is really going to have to come to terms with the fact how much he has given up of his character in wanting to be united with Robin. That he's become much less a desirable man, in fact, by his desire to, have a relationship with his partner. All right. Anyway, so the 147 thing with the dragons gives us, the pointer to the fact that meeting, as you said, with Emilia Crichton at the end of Running Grave should have been where she says, hey, come on. She just gave a billionaire 10 stitches, and he's denied. He says that I love one of the unnamed sources in the Times says that Landon Dormer or Thingy Dormer, I think Ilse calls her the first thing. Whenever someone says Thingy in Harry Potter, that's not a good thing. In Harry or anything in Rowling. So she's basically called Dormer the Dark Lord there. That interviewer for the Times asks for a comment from Dormer's office. He says Landon's really not into drama or lies. Now, how could anyone spend 10 minutes with Charlotte Campbell Ross and not be into drama and lies? I mean, that's kind of like that's like she has hips, breasts, and long hair. I mean, that's who she is drama and lies. I mean,
there's some minimal amount of research you need to do to come up with drama and lies.
Seriously, I think that beauty, drama, and lies are pretty much the complete Charlotte Campbell Ross package, right? I mean, she's brilliant too. She's funny, but drama and lies are right up there with the essentials. All right, I hope that answers your question about my structural work. Simply, after the fact of your discovery, I'm all with you on the fact that the end of Running Grave should bleed right into the revelation in Strike 8 that Charlotte was murdered. You mentioned earlier the literature and life are, Rowling's lake. I love the alliteration. Yeah, that's great. Maybe books and bio too. There's a Romeo and Juliet moment in Running Grave that almost everyone missed, Nick. What is it, and why should we care if we're trying to figure out how Charlotte died, who killed her, etc.?
Okay, so this was in the notices to the papers, and there's a couple of things that caught my eye. So there was a statement from Emilia and her mother, and then there was a separate statement from her half-brother, Sacha Lagarde, who's a professional actor. And he gives or quotes a passage from Romeo and Juliet, as Shakespeare so often is, particularly when you take a section of it and look at it. It's quite beautiful. Death lies on her like an untimely frost upon the sweetest flower of all the field. Now that's from the end of Romeo and Juliet, and it's from Lord Capulet, Juliet's father. Of course, the whole reason why Juliet commits suicide, you could argue, is because of Lord Capulet's insistence that his daughter marries Paris. Now, what I didn't appreciate at the time, but what you picked up, John, was actually at the point he says that, Juliet hadn't committed suicide. This is in Act 4. So this is the point at which Juliet takes the draft of living death and appears to be dead, but she hasn't committed suicide at the point that said. Now, Sacha, being an actor, surely must know this better than I. So is there some sort of hidden message in there? And John, I think you found something else about his name. Are we ready to point at our first suspect in the murder of Charlotte Campbell?
Yeah, first of all, Sacha Lagarde, he's a professional thespian. This is standard repertoire. He knows Romeo and Juliet. Hence his familiarity that he can drop this line off the cuff. You assume it's not that studied, but as you point out, it's a fake suicide. It's our first big red flag. Whoa, it's a fake suicide. And look, we know that Emilia is her only full-blooded sibling. So now we've got a step sibling that's making this comment about a fake suicide. Now that's again, if you've got a semaphore kit with flags, you're going to pull out all the red flags from your kit there and start waving them like, whoa. But the big fun thing there is Sacha Lagarde, his name, Lagarde, I mean, as you might expect, comes from, it's like a closed-in space, usually for a protection. Some people say it's just a garden, hence Lagarde. And Sacha comes from the word Alexander, which is another word for savior or Messiah. It means literally the helper of men. So it's a pretty nice name. It's the nice gardener. It's the guy you meet on the church grounds after a funeral, and he takes you around and it shows you the property. It's a nice thing. But in Troubled Blood, my favorite, outside of Christmas Pig and Deathly Hallows, Troubled Blood is still just, it's just the peak. It's just a great thing. But in that book, Max Priestwood, the largest symbol of the church, he's the cross writ large. This is the truth. This is the defining symbol of Rowling's work is the cross. And the cross speaks here and says that he was once in a play with Charlotte's brother, and she met Charlotte at a party after an event with the brother that he calls Simon Lagarde. Not Sacha, but Simon Lagarde. Now, maybe that's just Max Priestwood misspeaking. But whenever you see that name, Simon, okay, that's the... Is there another Lake Tell as big as Simon, Nick?
As a casual vacancy fan, that name sends shivers down my spine.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to explain that in a minute. But for our listeners that may not be up to speed on this, there are 7 crises or unresolved issues that haunt J.K. Rowling. And, we'll go through them at a different thing. But the first 2 are just very well documented. Rowling talks about the death of her mother as the depth charge that blew up her life. And you get that. I mean, that's really the death of Lily Potter and stuff. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there about Rowling and her mom. But Rowling and her dad, that's a live bomb, okay? And I know most of this, I should say, because of Nick's researches. So, I mean, I'm going to come off as the real late guy here. But Rowling is conceived illegitimately. It's possible it was a pregnancy trap. And so she was born, 4 or 5 months after her parents' marriage. And there's a sense, and Nick will have to explain, the class elements involved in this, especially in Peter Rowling's life. But we do know that from the BBC interview A Day in the Life that Rowling did in 2007, was it a year in the life? But anyway, in that interview, she said that her father wanted a boy and was very disappointed that she was a girl, and that wasn't upset that Diane was a girl, but continued to be disappointed that Jo was not a girl, and that they even had a name chosen for her, which was Simon John. Now, that was because his name is Peter John, and Simon and Peter are near synonyms. I know they don't sound a lot alike, but because of the Apostle Peter, his original name was Simon Bar-Jonah. And so throughout history, you get Simon and Peter being as in sync. And we see how painful Rowling remembers her childhood and her relationships with her father in Casual Vacancy. As Nick has said, really the most transparent autobiographical piece that Rowling's ever written. In that the real monster of that book is the father, Simon Price. I'll let Nick talk about that if he wants to. But all the Peters and Simons inside Harry Potter, Cormoran Strike, everything is Casual Vacancy are bad guys. There's Peter Pettigrew, most obviously. There's the Peter who's the assistant to Johnny Ropey. There's the Simmons house. There's the St. Peter's nursing home where Luca Ricci and the really wicked Ricci father is. All the Luciferian characters in Troubled Blood wind up at St. Peter's. If you see the name Peter or Simon in Harry Potter or anything, or Cormoran Strike or anything Rowling has written, she's talking about a wicked man. Or at least someone who is compromised somehow. And that's a tell on her part. And so here we have Max Priestwood, the truth teller, calling Sasha Lagarde Simon Lagarde. Now, again, maybe it's a failure of memory, but when the truth teller even has a slip, it's that Rowling has ever thought of Sasha Lagarde as Simon Lagarde tells you that he has to jump way up on the suspect list. That this guy has some reason to want Charlotte dead. Maybe he's hired by the billionaires. I got to be thinking the billionaire's in here somewhere funding this whole thing. He wants her gone because she knows too many things. But that name is the Lake marker that Rowling is saying this guy is who you think he is. He's not the gardener who's there to help. That he's a bad guy who's putting up a very good front. I should say that Rowling in her post about the transgender issue and why she's been writing about it brings up specifically the fact that if transgenderism was what it is today when she was growing up, she could have easily been persuaded to take that route in order to become the son that her father always wanted. I mean, this is how fundamental this issue is in her psychological development. Anyway, that's a lot. Okay, you call it a fun find. I mean that's really a dark thing. But I think if we're putting together our list of suspects, and You got Jago Ross as a suspect. You got the billionaire as a suspect. And they're kind of obvious. They're a little too obvious. But boy, all the siblings have got to come on the page. They were hoping that she would cash into this billionaire's money and bring them out of all of their troubles. And she failed in that regard. All right. And we're in the lake. Here we are. We're more than knee deep in the lake here, right? You're the lake expert, Nick. The one area of your expertise and experience that always blows my mind is the UK class spectrum in context of people and events in the Strike series. And that's, I touched on that just briefly here about the whole Peter Rowling class condition at Rowling's conception as a child. And I hope you'll talk about that eventually. But you found a remarkable connection between Belgravia's Emilia, is it Crichton? I don't know how to pronounce it. Crichton. And the play, The Admirable Crichton. What is the backstory here about which American readers like me are entirely clueless? Who is the Admirable Crichton?
So I would like to talk more about Rowling and the British class system. I think it's important to her, maybe not consciously, because it isn't for many British people. But the British class system is so pervasive, is so structural to how we live. It's only really when I'm talking to you, John, that I'm conscious of it at all. But the Admirable Crichton. So I am in my mid-50s, and I think for British people of my age and older, we hear the word Crichton and we think of the Admirable Crichton. And the Admirable Crichton was a play by the author of Peter Pan, J.M. Barrie, and we know it most probably from a late 50s film of the play. And the story follows, Crichton was a butler, sort of chief servant to an aristocratic family, known for his competence and his abilities, and the family and the servants are marooned on a desert island. Absent any hope of escape. His employer, an aristocratic man, believes in the innate ability of people outside of the class system. And this is shown as their society sort of evolves on the island. Because Crichton is the only one that frankly knows how to do anything, he becomes the leader of the group. He becomes the aristocrat in their little social situation. To the point that he almost marries the Earl's daughter, the aristocrat's daughter, when they are rescued and brought back to civilization, and things uneasily revert to where they were. So that's people of my age and older. We hear Crichton, that's what we think. People who are younger in Britain and hear the word Crichton will think of a TV series, The Red Dwarf. Sort of received cult status on this side of the Atlantic. I think it's
never heard
probably
of it.
not to the same huge appeal to Americans. But Crichton is a robot, but with exactly the same qualities. So of all the people on the spaceship Red Dwarf, he's the one who knows how to do anything, even though he's in the most subservient position. Now, our Emilia Crichton, of course, is, I would say, upper middle class. Not quite aristocratic, but upper middle class. The higher end of our social strata. And we've seen a lot of characters that are either upper class or upper middle class, and they tend to be fairly useless individuals. They have huge character flaws. They are not people that you would want to introduce to your mother, let alone have an evening with. Emilia at least is grounded. She has her own business. Of the family, it seems like she is the one that is organizing things in terms of Charlotte. So she's organizing the funeral. She's making decisions for Charlotte's children in terms of what they should and shouldn't see in terms of a suicide note. So I think we can put her down on the competent side of things, even though she's clearly not the servant type of Crichton, but she has that competent decision-making sort of persona. I guess much more popular in the States would be Jeeves and Wooster.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
She is the Jeeves.
Okay. You mentioned in our back channels, our moderators' back channels, that her husband has a position that suggests that he's upper class. Maybe not an aristocrat, but close.
Right. So yeah. So he's an officer in the Blues and Royals. So the Blues and Royals.
He sees my face and my blank stare.
Yeah. So they're a mounted regiment, which John found absolutely astonishing that here in Britain we have mounted regiments. One of two that guard the king. We have the Life Guards, the senior regiment, and the Blues and Royals. They are the most aristocratic regiment in the British Army. So they are at the very top of the social strata. Lest you think that the British Army is now little more than ceremonial, they have a day job. So in their day job, they are an armored reconnaissance regiment.
Okay, this is an interesting thing, though. It sounds like her husband has money, and she has some money. I mean, she's in Belgravia. That's not the down and outers spot in London, but she still owns a shop. You know, she's a shopkeeper. That's a different caste entirely from someone who shops in those places. Someone who works in those places is something different. And we see, again, going back to 147, forgive me, I'm going to lean on that today. We see that John Bristow, the Bristow fortune has largely just gone away. That we only learn at the end that the stock that he has from his stepfather and his mother really isn't worth that much money. He needs Lula Landry's money. The Chiswells, because of a brother-in-law's mismanagement. What was his name again? He had to be one of the most comic figures in the whole series.
Jasper?
Not Jasper, but the son-in-law that didn't invest the money properly and so lost half the family fortune. That we see the Chiswells are not quite down and out. Izzy is in good shape because she inherited her mother's money. So she's independent of this stuff. But the other Chiswells, they're in a hard way, to include Raph. You know, Raph isn't going to inherit anything anyway, just because of who he is. But he's grown up with money and in a position of privilege, and now he's looking at a life where he's not going to be able to do that. He dreams of being able to live on the Riviera via his stubs. Emilia and her husband, it looks like that they came from real money. You know, that the father had that castle on the island of Arran. You know, how do you pronounce that? What's the name of the
Arran.
Arran.
The Isle of Arran.
Arran. Yeah. Okay. And now she's a shopkeeper. I think there's a motive in here about the class levels. That again, she's happy if Strike just lets Charlotte be buried and forgotten. She's happy to have Strike tell her what was in the suicide note. Just happy to just go along. And this idiot guy, as you said, he's just throwing away everything he's ever learned as a red cap or anything. And I'm not going to interview at all. I want this to be finished. And she's happy to do that because maybe she made some money. Maybe she got a deal. I mean, she went on vacation as soon as Charlotte died. She went on a 2-week vacation in the country. That doesn't sound like something that a shopkeeper does. Anyway, the class thing. I love the class thing because that's the kind of thing that if you don't get Rowling's situation, and I do hope you'll eventually share, Nick, maybe in a book or something, you're going to share the whole Peter Rowling history as much as we know it, as much as it can be known from the records and such, that Rowling was in something like that situation herself as a child. She grew up breathing that as her act.
Well, before we get too chilly out here in the lake, let's pop into the shed and warm up for a little bit. John, you talked in your piece about Rowling's signature misdirection, that technique she has that makes it at least as likely that Charlotte was murdered as opposed to having committed suicide. And you used the term defamiliarization.
Yeah, I have to admit that Rowling Studies, the last 20 years has really been my education in English literature. I really didn't use the word defamiliarization until I got into Rowling Studies. All right, I'm as sure as one gets with this kind of speculation, which is not very sure indeed, but is that because of the setup of Charlotte committing suicide, our believing it and it not being so is so carefully done. I think Charlotte was murdered because we're led so surely to believe that it wasn't a murder. That's in absolute conformity with Rowling's most distinctive aim and method in her writing, namely knocking her readers off their high horse of accepted ideas via a strong turn away from the expected and conventional storyline or genre topos. I've discussed this in a lot at Hogwarts Professor. You just go to Hogwarts Professor, the weblog, and type in defamiliarization or something. The one genre and meta literary guides for talking seriously about who killed Lita Strike is the part where I really went into this. But to see why Uncle Ted and Dave Polworth are simultaneously really disturbing to readers as potential suspects in Lita's death, and for that reason, very likely candidates, one needs to understand Rowling's use of what I call, what lit geeks call defamiliarization and misdirection. To get that, you have to understand how Rowling writes and what her objectives are. The first thing is the big reveal at the story finish has to be a surprise, a shock. In Russian formalist language, a defamiliarizing knight's move. A knight is a weird chess piece, right? It looks like it's going forward and then it goes sideways. It looks like it's a castle or a rook, and all of a sudden it's a bishop. How does it do that? That knight's move is what literature does. The actual murderer has to be someone that we really didn't suspect, and certainly not a man or woman whom the characters inside the story believe it. Those are the last people. Rowling doesn't work that way. She's someone well versed in the guides, the goals, the gods and goddesses of detective fiction, and as a lover of the big twist finish. Rowling is trying to blow up our conventional biases by having us experience estrangement, in Coleridge's language. She has this experience, that estrangement in her series, by our discovery of how blind we have been. For that reason alone, we know that Whittaker and Rokeby didn't kill Lita Strike, okay? Because Strike believes that Whittaker is evil and killed his mother. And even talking with Rokeby for a few minutes on the phone in Troubled Blood, or hearing the story of his conception talked about in public, caused the usually remarkably self-controlled Strike to lose his bearing and respond with unhinged outrage. If either Whittaker or Rokeby turn out to be the murderers of Lita Strike, where is the surprise, right? That'll just be like, oh, it's just like we always thought. And this works both ways. If the ending has to be a lightning strike surprise to the reader, then the door is open to some, to wingnut theories, like Lucy Fantoni did it, or the Whittaker grandfather, or Guy Sommet, they're the murderers. I get, the lightning strike idea. Those ideas are credible, if only in that they're preposterous, and we need something out of left field for the series finish. But Rowling's objectives are not limited just to shocking us, this defamiliarization thing. She also is determined to drive home a message, about violence against women, about bias and bigotry, and akin to that last, especially in terms of running grave in the cult thing, about the dangers of unthinking and belief, what Rowling refers to in all her interviews as fundamentalism. There must also be a subliminal but profound illustration of spiritual reality in her stories, especially with respect to there being life after death and some kind of judgment with respect to his soul's virtue and vice. That she calls that her obsession with morality and mortality. But you tell me, Nick, how the preposterous suspects like Sister Lucy and Old Man Whittaker meet those criteria, and I'll jump on either bandwagon. Means, motive, and opportunity are the standards in Strike worlds, the genre of crime novels and murder mysteries especially. So suspects have to be credible on all 3 points. But in the meta world of literary criticism, there are different standards than means, motive, and opportunity. Namely, what is specifically it is that the writer consistently tries to communicate. The usual suspects and the new nutty offerings don't check any of these boxes. Okay, and most important, in the essentials of Rowling's Lake inspiration and shed artistry, is her creating story rings that act as alchemical alembics on the hearts of her readers. Her characters embrace and experience transformational change about how they see and understand themselves in the world. Their readers, we suspend disbelief in poetic faith and imagination. We're expected to share in this cathartic change via imaginative experience of the subliminal structure and symbolism as well as the surface story points. The murderer of Lita Strike, or of Charlotte Campbell, to have this metaphoric effect on Strike and on the readers of her stories is going to have to be the closest thing to a mirror reflection to Cormoran as exists on planet Earth. Okay, we already have the rings and the literary alchemy in full force. We just need the confrontation with self that forces transcendence of Strike's identity and ego. In Lita Strike's case, I think that's Ted Nancaro or Dave Polworth. But you take that meta-literary approach to explaining why Charlotte Campbell was murdered rather than committing suicide, that turns largely on how well readers are set up to accept, even expect the idea that Charlotte topped herself. Charlotte, in a nutshell, having killed herself is no surprise. It's expected. In every Strike novel, her predilection for self-harm, either staged or for real, is mentioned. It's Strike's concern about this that moved him to chase after her in his first explosive encounter with Robin at the top of the stairs in Cuckoo's Calling. Troubled Blood features the Easter morning suicide attempt at Simmons' house. There's the name, Simmons. There, and Strike's successful attempt to find and revive her. All through Running Grave, Charlotte seems increasingly fragile, hysterical, and pointed towards self-destruction. Readers are primed by all of these pointers to believe the news that she killed herself when the report finally arrives of her death. We were relieved. The idea that someone else killed her and staged the suicide, consequently, is very difficult for us to expect. We've, as I said earlier, we've all become Roy Carver and Cuckoo's Calling shouting, "The cow jumped!" And we become incredulous, even angry, Nick, that anybody like you would suggest she was murdered. The supposed suicide note, despite or even because of the recent events of her life, proves to these readers somehow that it has to have been a suicide. And those recent events add up to a lot in her Strike 7 encounters with Strike and reports about her, all of which suggest that she was in serious trouble. She's positively hounding her ex for him to talk with her. She needs to share something with him. Something perhaps about her family, about Jago Ross, about the American billionaire she's dating, about the arrest for attacking that man. Her expression is described, as you said, as strangely blank and glassy-eyed in the second chapter of Running Grave, a note that if readers gave it any thought, except as evidence not of her being drugged or despairing, but as a pointer to her mental illness and a habit of self-harm. Okay, so we've been set up that for the idea of Charlotte committing suicide, overlooking the evidence that she's in some kind of danger. But as I mentioned, there's also our readers' desire that she die. Okay? All of us wish, as he now does, for his emotional history and landscape to be cleared so he can marry Robin. We want the same thing that for Charlotte to be dead and buried. You know, we are on board consequently with Strike's indifference to her calls for help, some even writing involved apologetics for the fictional characters complicit in her death. Strike is not guilty, they're telling us, about this. Okay. Those who do this overlook the transformation in Strike from his having saved Charlotte from blood because he would do the same for anyone. A selfless, even sacrificial quality of love of neighbor or other into a character in Running Grave that deliberately and callously ignores another fictional person's anguish cries for help. That is not a step up. That is a profound descent from Strike's character. One those empathizing with him embrace because, like him, readers want Charlotte gone from the scene. So both Strike's and Robin's concern about her psychological shadow over their relationship evaporates. Okay. In addition to the prolonged setup of the idea that Charlotte would kill herself, and the as-long progression of Strike's feelings for Robin coming at last to the fore, requiring his feelings for Charlotte to recede, there's one more pointer to Rowling's defamiliarizing artistry in laying the ground or setting the trap for readers to embrace the death of Milady Berserko as a suicide, no questions asked. Everybody did except for you, Nick. The novel in which this stunning setup comes to a climax, Running Grave, is one about mind control and cultist thinking. Throughout this novel, readers witness the madness of the UHC and those who fall prey to its mind games and deception. Readers become pretty smug about this. Like Strike and Robin before her immersion in the real experience of sleep and calorie deprivation and narrative channeling of Chapman Farm, we believe that we readers are above or immune to that kind of deception. Why are these characters so easily taken in? Readers are meant to be asking themselves, I sure won't be susceptible to that kind of thing, which is perhaps the best possible setup for our being duped by a master of reader mind control. We are all victims, in other words. Well, okay, again, all of us, we're all victims, except for Nick, of a brilliant literary deception akin to the death of Dayu and the stage magic manifestations at Chapman Farm. Charlotte didn't kill herself, as Rowling has gone to such lengths to have us believe, but was murdered. And readers are about to have, in Strike 8, if your idea, and I'm on board with it, we readers are about to have the experience of cult survivors of being embarrassed by how much we accepted at face value without a critical look at the hard evidence. Along with Strike fandom felt that we could write Charlotte's suicide note themselves. There's no need to read it or to be astonished it's been destroyed by someone previous novels suggest must be a prime suspect in the victim's demise. Siblings are murderous, right? There's a Christmas pig thing, right? If you identify with this doll, I'm throwing that doll out the window. These half siblings are a dangerous lot, and yet we overlooked all the evidence that we have inside the books and in everything Rowling has written that this wasn't what it seemed because we've been brainwashed. Isn't that hilarious at the end of a brainwashing novel? I mean, that's just too much. All right, that was a long thing, but that I think is really the best part of what you've done, Nick, is that you've connected the dots between Rowling's core artistry, which is this shocking, defamiliarizing, estranging idea from the way we normally think, and having to come in to see how much of what we think is our acceptance of the surface story. What's easiest for us to believe, and that Charlotte's supposed suicide is that in spades for Strike. He wants her dead, therefore let's ignore all of the evidence. Okay, that's all meta-literary and heady stuff, but I think it makes a lot of sense, and it's ultimately what made me really come on board with the Charlotte was murdered theory was, there it is. But there are relatively mundane reasons for thinking that Charlotte was murdered, Nick, and you list them all in your post. What are the loose threads about Milady Berserko that will take a whole book, Strike 8, to tie up?
I mean, there are lots of mundane reasons. So we've talked about the blank and glassy-eyed Charlotte. If Charlotte committed suicide in this book, we don't know why, and we will never find out. There was the fight at Landon Dormers where Charlotte was arrested, and it by all accounts it was a violent affair. If Charlotte committed suicide, we don't know what that was about, and we will never find out. We have possible diagnosis of cancer. We have way back in Strike and Charlotte's history, wasn't she pregnant? If she committed suicide, we won't know any of that, and we will never find out. But for me, the biggest hanging loose end is Charlotte herself. In almost every book in which she appears, there is so long farewell moment. Back in Cuckoo's Calling, when Strike picks up the boxes, that's it. Charlotte's done. We won't see Charlotte again. When Strike solves the divorce case and allows Charlotte to divorce Jago with her money largely intact, great, that's done now. We won't see Charlotte again. And yet every book, I talk about this with Beatrice Groves. When a new book is coming up, and the question is, will we see Charlotte? No, we won't see Charlotte again. She's done. She always comes back. And if this was just a suicide, why? Why did we need to know about Landon Dormer? Why did we need to know about the breakup with Jago and her heartless attitude to her own children? These are just, there's no depth to them. There's no meaning unless Charlotte's character has a bigger impact in the series. And just committing suicide isn't it. It can't be it. I mean, you conclude your piece, John, with some notes about suicide in the Strike series, and there've been quite a few of them. And you talk about a 3-part approach. Now, this was challenging. It was challenging to me, and I think to some of our readers as well. Why don't you close the podcast with your Parthian shot of all the suicides in Rowling's work, especially those in the Strike novels, and Charlotte's theoretical suicide in the Running Grave. Okay,
I mean, this is going to be a ring, I guess. Nick, we're gonna start with what you and I talk about as the 4th generation of Rowling Studies, And what we aim to do here at Rowling Studies, the podcast, is, again, take a larger view of Rowling's work than just the current book and the one that's coming, but to read her work in light of all of her other work. And we aim to do that, obviously profound emphasis on her shed artistry. And also, we're going to bring Rowling back into Rowling Studies and talk about her personally. And when you get to Rowling's, her defamiliarizing move here with Charlotte being murdered, all of those things come into play. I mean, I talked already about just the structural piece. You know, the beginning of the first book in the series, the middle of the central books in the series, and the end of the seventh book, at least in the first ring cycle of the series, point us to the suicide was staged and the death was really a murder. And that's going to all be revealed in the eighth book, cleverly concealed in Running Grave. So that's our shed, you know, that ring argument is all shed. And then we went, you know, into the meta-literary reasons, which is Rowling's signature penchant for defamiliarization. Okay? You know, the reason we all thought, Nick accepted, that Charlotte topped herself is despite the surfeit of fake suicides in the series, Rowling has been talking on slow drip for 7 books about Charlotte as a potential suicide and showed us an earnest attempt at self-slaughter and troubled blood. I mean, so that, you know, it's mind control. She's got us, right? That's the meta-literary stuff. That's shed. And then we go back to the lake thing, that Simon Lagarde discussion. That's a critical lake issue for Rowling. Rowling's non-relationship with her father consequent to his emotional abuse of her as a young woman. Okay, but I want to go back into the lake. Okay, this is a 4th generation Rowling Studies podcast, one disguised as a Running Grave discussion and a speculation about Strike 8 with another lake question. Why is suicide, successful, attempted but survived, fake to cover up murders, whatever? Why is suicide such a big deal in the Strike series? The only suicides I can think of in the Potter books are Dumbledore's assisted death by Snape, which is really more like euthanasia than self-destruction, and Pettigrew's auto-strangulation. And those don't work really as suicides. You know, Crystal Whedon kills herself in Casual Vacancy's Nightmare Climax, yeah. But in that book of despairing characters, it's a marvel she's the only one. I mean, I think everybody is a potential for suicide in Casual Vacancy, right? In the Strike novels, in contrast, there's at least one per book. And there are a bevy in Running Grave. Okay, we start off with the Lula Landry staged suicide in Cuckoo. We got the Elspeth Fancourt version of Sylvia Plath's suicide with head in the oven type thing. That's the foundation crime of Silkworm. Lita's Strike mysterious death that was ruled a suicide is center stage in Career of Evil. We get Jasper Chiswell's death on Lethal White. It's a patricide staged as a suicide. Janice Beatty's first Douthwaite-inspired murder in Troubled Blood was the staged suicide of Joanne Hammond. The epigraph source for Strike 4-2 was Ibsen's Rosmersholm, a play that ends with a double suicide. All things suicidal pick up in Strike 6. Edie Ledwell attempted suicide before she was murdered in Think Back Heart. He and Nevin identifies as suicidal. And anomic suicide, per Durkheim, is a theme of that book, if not the whole series. Characters committing or attempting suicide in Running Grave include Flora Brewster, The Stolen Prophet, Allie Graves, Emily Pirbright, Sherry Gittins, Jordan Rainey, and of course Charlotte Campbell Ross. I think that your theory, the strange death of Charlotte Campbell, that she was murdered. I want to end this conversation, if we're going to end it here, you know, with some lake thoughts about this focus on suicides, especially those that were actual murders and as good as murders. Self-destruction consequent to being driven to it. We have to start in Rowling's Lake and ask what unresolved personal issues or experiences could have inspired this series-long preoccupation with suicide. Now, when you're in the lake, there's a lot of things in the lake, right? We don't have a clear line of sight. There can be any number of experiences that Rowling has had, traumatic or personal or private, about which we know nothing. The death by suicide of a friend, a suicide attempt in her family or circle of acquaintances, even suicides that she heard about in her Lumos days of visiting orphanages and caged children. But, you know, a more obvious and near certain grounding for Rowling's borderline obsessive writing about suicide is her own experience at the nadir of her life with clinical depression. an experience in 1994 as a single mother after the failure of her first marriage that she described as becoming suicidal. She went public with this revelation in 2012, the year before Cuckoo's Calling was published. As she wrote in 2020, like every other human being on this planet, I have a complex backstory which shapes my fears, my interests, and my opinions. I never forget that inner complexity when I'm creating a fictional character. I think it's clear that she never forgets her complex backstory when she's planning out, say, 10-book novels either. That so many of the suicides in the Strike series are actually murders. And most are acts of fear, depression, or despair into which the suicides are driven by others, delivers the message that true suicide as such is a myth. Killing one's self as a positive choice rather than from despair, that there are no other choices to be made and that death is preferable to the pain on offer in broken relationships, does not appear in the Strike novels. Someone else is always responsible, at least in part. A threatening Abigail Glover, a John Bristow murderer who disguises as suicide, or a killer enemy who is invisibly in the background of the attempted self-destruction. And Rowling shows her hands on this in D.B. Mack, probably a character that's least like her, right? An L.A. black rapper of gigantic size. But asked about Lula Landry's suicide, the rapper cum psychologist commented that her death was really a murder months before Strike was able to prove it. He says, Lula Landry's death by suicide was fucked up, man. That was fucked up, replied D.B., running his hand over his smooth head. His voice was soft, deep, and hoarse. I'm not doing a very good impersonation. Has the faintest trace of a lisp. That's what they do to success. They hunt you down. They tear you down. That's what envy does, my friend. The motherfucking press chased her out that window. Let her rest in peace, I say. She's getting peace right now. Okay. Now, if Evan Willis is right about the center of its detractors pyramid being ink black heart, then Rowling's shed work to transform her lake inspiration around her own history of suicidal thoughts into universal and sublime meaning for her global audience makes a certain sense, the meaning being in the middle of structural artistry. It's in Strike 6 that Rowling Galbraith brings up anomic suicide, which is a subject explored in a book by Emilia Crichton you find in the Art Studio's bookshelf. That theme, a critique of the prisons in which internet-captured souls live, is much more inclusive and universal than her projecting into story her own experience of sexual assault, an abusive marriage, clinical depression, and suicidal thoughts. She's raising her lake inspiration to really a global theme about an indictment really of our age. A fourth-generation discussion of suicides will have to include the backdrop of Christmas Pig, also conceived in 2012, namely the issue of sibling rivalry, even of murderously violent step-siblings. All right? You got John and Charlie Bristow with Lula Landry. We got Freddie and Raph Chiswell. We got Abigail Glover and Dayu Graves Wace. Those are the axis crimes of the series. Future readers of Rowling's work will not fail to connect the dots, as we've already done in Christmas Pig, between Rowling's home situation at the time of her planning the Strike series and the writing of the first book. Okay? And this is probably going to upset people, but here it is. The Christmas Pig differs from the Strike series in that it reflects another Murray family issue. It has as its foundation story the agony of a young child in a blended family whose biological father is absent physically and emotionally, and whose older stepsister is a bully consequent to her own issues about daddy. The serious reader of Rowling, and one even superficially familiar with her life, does not strain his or her eyes to see David and Mackenzie Murray and Jessica Orontes here as the story models for Jack and Holly, especially as Mackenzie Jean Murray was 7 years old in 2012, the year of the story's inspiration and the age of Jack, the boy in the story. In fact, Mackenzie's age in the story and the age of Jessica Orontes at that time in 2012 are exact matches. The only bit absent from that summary is Holly's symbolic murder of her stepbrother, Jack, by throwing him out the window of a moving car, the identity object of his mother's love and his own worth. If Christmas Pig were a Strike novel, the story would be reorganized so that it was about discovering that, Holly did it. Holly was the murderer, right? That lake identification of Rowling story stuff if done correctly, should be immediately followed, as I think I'm already doing here, a discussion of what work Rowling does with this detritus from her unconscious mind's struggle with painful issues to raise them up from projection narrative into engaging story. Okay? And I've written all that up about Christmas Pig. And discussing the Strike series in light of Pig, which is to say in light of her work as a whole, as well as its roots at the bottom of Rowling's lake and its fruits cultivated in her shed greenhouse, is the work of fourth-generation Potter pundits and serious strikers. Here I am. Here we are, Nick. Our first podcast is supposed to be fourth-generation stuff, and we're talking about the Strike novel in hand and Strike 8, the one on the horizon. And I'm hoping that the Hypocrisy Police Harpies will give me a pass here in consideration of my deployment of the three aspects of fourth-generation criticism. We're talking about her work as a whole, we're talking about the lake content, and we're talking about the shed stuff. Your theory, Nick, that Charlotte was murdered, I think is even more credible in light of that three-tiered approach. Okay? An understanding of Rowling's previous work is essential in grasping what she's doing in the Strike novels. An awareness of her life issues clarifies the story's inspiration, and the knowledge of her shed artistry, the traditional tools she deploys to deliver her anagogical meaning of transformation, even apotheosis, all that mythological content of her work, is what simultaneously lifts them above popular fiction and explains their popularity. Okay? Structure, defamiliarization, Peter Simon, and suicide, after Orontes, that gets us there. There's a lot more to say about suicide, and I hope we'll do this in future podcasts. We've got to talk about Solway and Coagula, self-transformation by intentional self-destruction. I mean, that's suicide, right? But this podcast is really just an opening marker on that subject and a continuing introduction to fourth-generation thinking and methodology. Okay, that's a lot. Okay, but Nick, this all goes back eventually to, how you did it. Because if you hadn't figured it, I know that if you hadn't come up with this idea, it never would have occurred to me. I'm not giving place to anybody, Nick, on my grasp of Rowling's shed artistry, her defamiliarization. My PhD thesis is on this, and I missed the fact that Charlotte was almost certainly murdered. I mean, that to me is simultaneously embarrassing to me, and I think a tribute to Rowling's remarkable skills in this. I mean, that all of her work from book 1 to book 7 was to set us up for that. Hats off to you for getting it, and to Rowling, for being that good.
I mean, I have to say, when I was reading it, it wasn't even a suspicion. As I say, I was shocked. I was shocked really reading the Emilia interview that she didn't demand the investigation. But that is largely down to you and the guys at Hogwarts Professor that have been, banging this chiastic structure drum for so long that it's become embedded in me as I read. I think perhaps I had the benefit that I was head down going for it cover to cover, whereas very much you were doing the Herculean task. And guys, if you haven't read it, you really do need to read John's ring structure posts on the running grave in meticulous detail. John has documented not just the structure of the series and the structure of the book, but of each individual part. And I mean, even just looking at the charts.
Again, just one more point of embarrassment for me that the guy that pointed to the answer that you found was oblivious to that answer. This has been a play. I hope our listeners have half the fun that we've had doing this. What's next on the agenda? We've talked about. Are we going to do a Christmas pig show or a Christmas Carol, Christmas pig show? I mean, what are we going to do for?
So we're aiming to release a podcast every 2 weeks or every fortnight for guys this side of the Atlantic. So I'm Christmas themed.
Oh, think about that. I just posted something at the Substack site that Robin is sterile. Changed my mind. And it's that was a lot of fun to write. I think it's on much shakier ground than Charlotte Campbell committed suicide, but you'll see the shed, you'll see the lake, See the previous work thing coming up there in that conversation. And I do hope we'll talk about that. There's a website, rowlingstudies.com, and it has a chat option on it, believe it or not. And you can send us questions. They'll pop right into our inboxes, and we will be sure to discuss those, what things that you want us to discuss, what aspects of this show upset you or intrigued you, or you want to know more about, and what shows you want us to do in the future. We've got plenty to talk about here, because we're really just beginning to open up, I think, the proper methodology for reading Rowling, this fourth generation approach.
Yeah, I think, and if fourth generation scholarship is going to work, it needs to be a dialogue. So guys, please do get in touch, either in the chat facility at Hogwarts Professor, or submit your questions at Rowling Studies.